Hi, my name is Sam. This week I'm going to be looking at global warming. Global warming is an important topic because it seems that we could have carbon taxes thrust on us when the evidence isn't definite. There are those who say that climate change is the end of the world and those who say it's a load of rubbish. Well, I'm here to set the record straight. First, let's look at this graph. The numbers on the graph represent wavelength. 4 represents a very short wavelength and 100 represents a much longer wavelength. Now look at the gases. Water vapour absorbs radiation with a wavelength of 18 to 30 micrometers long, and CO2 absorbs radiation with a wavelength of 8 to 18 micrometers long. This all sounds very technical, but basically CO2 absorbs certain electromagnetic waves from the sun that water vapour doesn't. If we had a radiation measurement, we can see that water vapour absorbs a lot of the radiation, CO2 absorbs the vast majority of the leftover radiation, and the radiation outside these two gases would be absorbed by things like nitrogen and methane. So it's clear that increasing CO2 would increase global warming because there would be more radiation trapped in by the CO2. The question is, how much more warming would increasing CO2 cause? It's clear that CO2 would increase global warming because it's a greenhouse gas. The trouble is we don't know how much CO2 would be needed to be released to cause dramatic change. If we release loads of CO2, there's a slight increase in temperature, but not much. It's only when the rise in temperature melts ice that uncovers swamps, that releases more CO2, that heats up the earth, that melts more ice, that uncovers more swamps from under the ice, that releases more CO2, etc., that we're concerned. This loop of temperature increase followed by ice melting followed by more CO2 being released is called a positive feedback loop. It's like Al Gore famously said, when there is more CO2, the temperature goes up. But it's also true that temperature goes up before CO2. If we look at the top of the graph he was talking about, we can see that temperature is 800 years ahead of CO2, but at the bottom, CO2 is ahead of temperature. It's because the initial CO2 boost is what creates the increase in temperature, and eventually temperature goes on to begin to drive CO2 increase as well as other things. So Gore wasn't wrong, he just didn't fully know his science. There's also a concern about ice ages. People seem to think that if the world heats up, the Gulf Stream will shut down and the world will freeze over. But to do this, the ice caps would have to melt a lot more than they have done. We all know that masses of ice have been melting, but there's still the permafrost in the main body of the ice caps, and this will take a lot longer to melt. It's only when these parts melt that the apocalypse is on its way. This is serious problems. This is more than a problem. Though what are the problems we may really be faced with? Besides 2-foot rise in sea levels that'll cost billions to counteract against, what are the real dangers? Well, famine in developing countries is a serious risk, as well as rivers like the Amazon which feed millions of people being threatened, plus the cost of insurance and habitat protection, and finally the increase of hostile weather. But not killer tidal waves, ice ages and the moon crashing into us. These sound like a tabloid got hold of a scientist and asked what's the worst that can happen. However, it's still a serious problem. Climate change may threaten our way of life and the lives of many people. I feel that we have an obligation, if not an opportunity, to help each other. Though I understand how we are put off when people say silly things like, climate change is a hoax, or it's the end of the world. Those who say it's a hoax usually sell sports cars for a living, and those who say it's the end of the world probably don't know much about science. What we need is the facts, the figures and the forecasts. I plan to make a video about the errors of the very convincing Great Global Warming swindle, which literally makes up its evidence to critique climatologists, and another one on how to reduce your carbon output. In the meantime, please look at YouTube users like Potholer54 or search for the Great Global Warming swindle errors. We live in an incredible planet and I look forward to showing you how it works. In the meantime, this was Slamming Sam on climate change.